Attila talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there isn't a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a tax problem, call his office or visit his website. If you don't have a tax problem, then your current tax problem is taxes themselves, which is the topic of today's discussion. The complexity of the tax system is so burdensome, it is now costing taxpayers and the economy over $536 billion annually. And with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act now being passed, that is surely about to change up even more and become even more complex. The first question we should be asking is, how do we really measure taxpayers' compliance burden?
Well, that is a good question. And the fact of the matter is the IRS uses false data to talk about what the cost of the tax system is. The IRS will always tell us that the Internal Revenue Service is the most efficient government agency out there because they collect about $100 worth of taxes for every roughly 50 cents worth of cost to the agency. But what that does not measure is the cost to the taxpayer, how much it costs the taxpayer to pay money into the IRS. The federal government will collect just about $5 trillion in taxes. The IRS spends very little money to actually collect that money. Only 2% of federal revenue is collected through enforcement action. But it's true that the IRS spends, roughly $10 to $12 billion a year in the administration of the tax code. They've got roughly 80,000 employees that they're paying to do all the processing and so on. But the fact of the matter is the heaviest part of the burden falls on the shoulders of the American taxpayer, individuals and businesses, primarily businesses, to comply with the law. And I'll just give you the best example. As I said, about $5.2 trillion of revenue will be collected by the federal government, but almost 60% of that revenue is not collected by the IRS at all. It's not even paid in by the individual taxpayers. It's collected by American businesses through wage withholding, and those businesses pay that money over to the IRS. So American businesses are the primary unpaid tax collector in the United States. And when I say unpaid, they don't get any remuneration from the IRS to collect the tax and fill out the forms and make the deposits and do all the things they have to do to stay compliant with the employees withholding requirements. So these burdens fall on businesses and individuals. The IRS is not paying these costs. And when they talk about the efficiency of the agency, they don't take into consider how much time, effort, and resources it takes American businesses to comply with this massive tax code.
They love to brag about the efficiency of the agency without considering that they are the largest police force on the planet and outsource 98% of their work to the American people.
And that's exactly right. If you talk about the largest police force on the planet, that's a fact. Certainly the largest police force in America, no question about that. And this police force has the reach that no other police force has unless you go into a completely totalitarian regime. The IRS
they're policing every aspect of what you do when you buy and sell things on a daily basis.
That's exactly right. And the problem with it, that is driven by the fact that we've got an income tax-based system, which economists agree, by the way, that the income tax is the most inefficient way there is to collect revenue. There's all kinds of ways to collect revenue, different kinds of taxes that are far more efficient than the income tax, particularly the income tax we have right now. Let's get back to this efficiency claim that the IRS has. We're the most efficient government agency. Well, we already talked about the percentages of revenue collected by businesses, but let's look at the number of tax returns. In the 2025 tax filing season, there are roughly 165 million individual income tax returns filed with the Internal Revenue Service. Add roughly another 105 million business tax returns, and you've got roughly 275 million business and personal tax returns filed with the IRS. This is a massive amount of paperwork people have to engage in to produce this information. And that's just one part of the puzzle. Another part of the puzzle is the information returns that are filed with the IRS, the W-2s and 1099s. These information returns have to be prepared and filed by third-party businesses that have transactions with individual taxpayers. So, for example, if you're an investor and you're buying and selling securities through an investment company, that brokerage has a responsibility to file 1099s with the IRS to report your transactions. All right, this gets to your point, Josh, that the IRS is spying on everything that everybody does. does. Every single wage earner in America gets a W-2 form from their employer. So that employer has to keep track of all the wages, keep track of all the withholdings, send paperwork to the employee and to the IRS as to how much was earned, how much was withheld. This goes to both the federal and state taxing agencies. There's roughly 3.5 billion information returns that are filed with the IRS every single year. So we got 275 million tax returns, 3.5 billion information returns. This is a river of flowing into the Internal Revenue Service every single year that the agency uses to administer this tax law. This is not an efficient system. This is the most inefficient system that somebody could possibly dream up. And for the IRS to say that they're the most efficient government agency, the most productive government agency, is completely false and totally misleading, because the overwhelming majority of costs incurred by the tax system are borne by the taxpayers.
Well, there's no doubt that the tax system we currently have, especially with all the information returns that you described, is the most inefficient tax system. It is the most efficient way to train the Palantir AI databases into knowing everything about everyone, which is actually what this is all about, isn't it?
It's interesting that you mentioned the Palantir databases. About 4 or 5, maybe 6 years ago, IRS contracted directly with Palantir, a $100 million contract, to have their data processing experts build artificial intelligence programs for the IRS to analyze trillions of bits of data that the IRS is collecting from all public database sources. We're talking about social media sources and every other kind of public database that's out there. The IRS grabs this information, they filter this information, they use the artificial intelligence to predict results and trends and behavior and so on. They use that information to develop audit initiatives and enforcement targets. And here's another thing that's very important. The Taxpayer Advocate over the years has done studies of the compliance burden. Years ago, I'm talking about 30 years ago now, in my book, How to Fire the IRS, which came out in 1992. The book is out of print now. I need to update it. In 1992, I talked about the compliance burden. I was one of the first guys in the United States to talk about what the true compliance costs were of this Internal Revenue Code. You can go back and look at my book, How to Fire the IRS, and I talk about the compliance costs in that book. Subsequent to the release of that book, the IRS's Office of the Taxpayer Advocate, this would have been in the late 90s, 8 to 10 years later, they started looking at what the compliance costs were, and they talk about the compliance burden being the time and money that taxpayers spend to comply with their tax filing responsibilities. And the time-related activities that they're talking about is record keeping, tax planning, gathering tax materials, learning about the tax law, completing the necessary forms, and submitting those forms to the IRS. These out-of-pocket costs are what they call the compliance burden. But there's something that the Taxpayer Advocate is missing. In all the studies we see of the compliance burden, there's an important part of the puzzle that is missing, and that is enforcement costs that are put on the shoulders of individual taxpayers. When somebody goes through a tax audit, they hire a tax professional to represent them. If they have to execute an appeal, they hire a tax professional to represent them. If somebody's dealing with IRS enforcement action, wage levies, bank levies, property seizures, tax liens, those types of, they hire a tax professional to represent them. If they have to negotiate an offer in compromise to settle their case, they generally hire a tax professional to represent them. But even if they do it themselves, all of the compiled by the Taxpayer Advocate in her calculation of the compliance burden do not take into account the costs that people incur in defending themselves from enforcement. All right. And even if you don't owe the IRS a dime, if you go through an audit and you have to go through an appeal and United States tax court case and you end up owing the IRS $0, which happens regularly, you still have to bear the cost of defending yourself. None of this is taken into account in the calculation of the compliance costs. The IRS mails out about 170 million letters and notices every single year to taxpayers. Now, every single one of those letters and notices don't go to an individual taxpayer. Taxpayers get multiple letters. So we're not talking about 170 million people, but we're still talking about 170 million letters. Some of those letters are soft letters where it's not an enforcement issue at all, where they're just saying, look, we think you made this mistake, check your tax return, you might have done this, or in the future do this. All right, those are soft soft notices that don't carry demands and potential for penalties. But many of those notices are enforcement letters. All right. They're audit notices or collection notices that have to be responded to properly and on time. If you don't, you lose your rights, end up getting run over by the IRS. All right. This is a massive cost that is borne by citizens and businesses to deal with this barrage, this blizzard of correspondence that goes out every single year. This is just one example. Another example is every single year the IRS is about 3.5 million third-party letters. 3.5 million third-party levies. These are bank levies and wage levies. When somebody gets a bank levy and a wage levy, or a senior citizen gets a levy on their Social Security account, this causes panic for taxpayers. They have to take time and energy and resources that they probably don't have to get that problem solved. These are expensive compliance costs that the IRS does not take into account in its calculations. Even at that, we're talking about $500 billion a year in compliance costs that are borne by individuals and businesses. This is over the top inefficient.
So the inefficiencies are mounting. At what point does it just collapse in on itself? I mean, obviously we should do something about it the right way, but at what point does the right way just have to happen because there's no other way?
Well, that's a good question. And I'll tell you something. When I wrote that book, How to Fire the IRS, and I proposed the plan in the early 1990s to abolish the Internal Revenue Service and the Internal Revenue Code and to go to a broad-based retail sales tax to replace the revenue, in my naivete, Josh, I believed that Congress was going to look at this idea, recognize that it's sound and that it's really a bulletproof way to deal with the problems that we're dealing with in America, and that Congress would come to its senses and it would do the right thing for the right reason and recognize that this is the way we have to do this. By the end of the 1990s, and as we turned into the 21st century, my naivete was gone, and I realized they're never going to do the right thing for the right reason, that they're going to stumble on to doing the right thing somehow, some way, and that the only way that was going to happen is when this system became so invasive, oppressive, and inefficient that it would collapse in on itself. Over the last 10 or 12 years, I've written a number of articles. The IRS's system is getting so overloaded that it's collapsing in on itself. The agency doesn't have the capacity to manage the data that's flowing into it, doesn't have the capacity to deal with the problems that are arising under the system. And Congress will say, well, we need more manpower. The IRS will say, we need more manpower and we need more money and more equipment. No, you need a more efficient system. What is going on right now is not working. It's not going to work because of the nature of the tax system. And again, it gets back to the core of what the tax system is, and that is an income tax system. And in order to effectively enforce an income tax system, you have to know every move that every person in the marketplace makes, where they earn their money, how they earn their money, where they spend it, how they spend it, how much they spend it. Every aspect of a person's private life has to be known by the government in order to properly enforce this system. And it can't know everything, Josh. It's not God. The government is not omniscient. It's not omnipotent, but it's doing everything it can to make itself like God by beefing up its computer systems and beefing up its access to data. This is just an incredibly inefficient way to manage a tax system.
Well, I do believe we're right on the precipice with AI. They're going to either figure out that it doesn't work, or they're going to figure out how to make AI control every aspect of our lives. So that's fun. We're going to see how that turns out. I really think that, the overt Marxist overtones of the income tax aside, if you ask any systems engineer, any CEO, any business person, a broken system does not scale. You cannot scale a system that doesn't work. Smaller scale, you can't scale it bigger just by getting more manpower, more resources, whatever. You can't make it work when it's bigger with more stuff.
We've got a tax system built on an unsound foundation. It's unsound morally, economically, and constitutionally. Apart from that, it is wildly inefficient. There's a study that was just released, Tax Foundation, a fantastic nonpartisan public policy research institute in Washington. Their study shows that about 7.1 billion hours are spent by Americans complying with the Internal Revenue Code. Think about that. 7.1 hours are spent by Americans complying with the tax code. Do you have any idea what kind of economic impact that has on productivity in America when instead of spending 7.1 billion hours at work, at home, on vacation, with your family, building your business or building your retirement, or physically with your own hands building a retirement home, for example, 7.1 billion hours
Even
is
at
the
even minimum wage, if you multiply minimum wage by that number, that is an insane number to take out.
There's no question about it. It's just out of control expensive to comply with this tax code. And nobody talks about this, Josh. As I said, I was one of the first. I'll tell you who the two people were. It was me and my friend Jim Payne, who's an economist that lives in Idaho. He wrote a book. I forget when he wrote the book. It was called Costly Returns. He did a study of this, and I did an analysis of it myself that was published in How to Fire the IRS. There were two guys in the country doing this work, Jim Payne and myself, and this was 30 years ago. Now, finally, this stuff is starting to bubble up and get talked about. But as I said earlier in the podcast, they're still not talking about the costs of enforcement. They're talking about the costs of compliance. Okay, fine. But they're ignoring the costs of enforcement. And in all fairness, they just don't have the experience that I have in understanding what the total costs and what the total burdens are on the shoulders of American taxpayers and businesses and individuals in complying with this tax code. They just don't have my experience, so they don't have the right lens to analyze this stuff. I have that lens. I have the experience. And I'm telling you, Josh, there's not 4 people in the country that have this experience.
Taxpayers, share this with your local and particularly your federal representatives so that we can get him an invite to the current administration to advise on some of this stuff. Because if there's ever a hope of eliminating the income tax, it has to be soon. I think that's true. I think it has to be soon. But what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we've got a perfect opportunity right now to do this. We've certainly got members of Congress on the Republican side of the aisle, which of course Republicans control the House and the Senate, that would be open to fundamentally reforming the tax code. I believe that sentiment is there. Certainly the White House has expressed a desire to fundamentally reform the tax code. The Big Beautiful Bill Act does not do that. The Big Beautiful Bill Act is just a continuation of what we have seen in this country for the last 30 years, which is tinkering around the edges of the tax code. The code is now more than 4 million words that have been changed more than 6,000 times just since 2001 alone. That doesn't even include the last 3 or 4 years of changes that have occurred over and over again. So it is time for change. There's no doubt about that, but we've got to have pressure put on Congress to make this happen.
Any other questions you want me to ask before we close?
No, I think that's good.
In that case, taxpayers, that will be the end of this episode. Thanks for watching. And remember, there's no such thing as a hopeless tax case. And if you think yours is the exception, get a hold of Dan here. He will help you see the daylight. Dan, tell them where else they can follow along with your taxpayers' rights crusade.
I'm at Pillow Talks Taxes. I'm on all the popular social medias. I'm on True Social. I'm on Facebook. I'm on TikTok, primarily right here on YouTube. Like and share these videos, especially with your federal and state representatives. Let's get a little pressure on Congress to bring me in and have me discuss these issues with some of the people in Washington. We can make a difference here if you like and share these videos with your friends and with your representatives. And if you do have a tax problem, go to my website, TaxHelpOnline.com, and you buy any book off my website at any price point, you get a free 15-minute consultation directly and personally with me, and I can guide you through your situation to a resolution. TaxHelpOnline.com.